"Ma'am, you're not being ignored, they just don't know how to hear you." The words didn't come out loud, not at first. They lived in Lily Dawson's hands, in the quiet precision of her fingers as they moved through the air, shaping meaning where silence had taken over. The restaurant had been buzzing just seconds before, glasses clinking, low laughter, the hum of expensive conversations. But now it all seemed to pause, like someone had pressed an invisible mute button. At table 12, a sharply dressed older woman sat stiffly, her eyes scanning faces that never quite met hers, her menu untouched, her lips pressed into a thin line of quiet resignation. Moments earlier, a man in a tailored suit had sighed loudly, tapping his watch, muttering something about service standards, assuming she was being difficult, assuming she was choosing not to respond. No one corrected him. No one stepped in. Except Lily. She had noticed the woman the moment she walked in. Something about the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her eyes searched instead of settled. Lily always noticed people like that. Maybe because she used to be one of them. Maybe because she had promised herself she never would look away again. Her uniform apron was slightly wrinkled, her name tag catching the soft amber light as she stepped forward, her heartbeat quick but steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she lifted her hands, gentle but sure, and signed slowly, clearly, "I'm here. I understand you." The woman's eyes widened, just a flicker at first, then something deeper, something almost fragile. Recognition. Relief. The tension in her shoulders eased as if someone had quietly unlocked something inside her. Lily continued, her movements fluid, respectful, asking what she would like to eat, explaining the specials, never once making it feel like an inconvenience. Around them, the room shifted. Conversations softened. Heads turned. A server near the bar froze mid-step, watching. Even the impatient man from earlier fell silent, his expression changing from irritation to something closer to discomfort. And from across the room, standing near the private dining corridor, Ethan. Carter saw everything. He hadn't planned to stay long. Just a quick check-in at one of his flagship locations before heading to another meeting. But now he couldn't look away. His mother, Margaret Carter, had always hated public spaces like this. Too loud, too fast, too full of people who didn't know how to meet her halfway. He had hired assistants, arranged private accommodations, built entire systems around making her life easier. And yet, he had never seen her smile in a place like this. Not like this. Not the way her lips now curved softly as she responded to Lily's hands, her own movements slower, practiced, but full of life. Ethan's chest tightened, something unfamiliar pressing against the carefully controlled rhythm of his thoughts. He had spent years solving problems with money, with influence, with precision, but this was different. This was simple, human, real. Lily nodded as Margaret finished signing, her eyes warm, her posture relaxed, as if this moment mattered more than anything else in the room. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She just stayed. And in that quiet exchange, something invisible shifted, not just for Margaret, but for everyone watching, including Ethan, who, for the first time in a long time, felt like he was the one standing on the outside of something he didn't fully understand, but desperately wanted to. The room slowly exhaled as the moment passed, conversations returning in cautious waves. But something had already changed, something subtle yet undeniable, like a shift in gravity that no one could quite name. Lily stepped back just slightly, giving Margaret space, her hands lowering but her attention never leaving the older woman's face. "I will be right back with your tea," she signed softly, her movements smaller now, almost private, as if the world around them no longer mattered. Margaret nodded, her fingers lifting with a careful grace to respond. "Thank you for seeing me." The words were simple, but they landed somewhere deep, somewhere Lily did not expect, and for a brief second, her composure wavered. She swallowed, offering a small smile before turning toward the kitchen, her steps quick but quiet. Behind the service counter, the noise rushed back in, orders being called, plates sliding across stainless steel, a manager's voice cutting through with sharp efficiency. "Table 12 has been waiting too long," he snapped without looking up, flipping through tickets. Lily paused, her hand tightening slightly around the notepad she carried. She was not being difficult, Lily said gently, keeping her voice low but steady. She just needed someone to communicate with her. The manager barely glanced up. "We are not running a special needs facility, Lily. Keep things moving." The words stung more than she expected, but she did not argue. She rarely did. Instead, she nodded once, turned, and focused on preparing Margaret's order herself, making sure every detail was right. Across the dining room, Ethan remained where he was, his attention no longer on the business metrics he had come to review, but entirely fixed on the quiet rhythm Lily had created at that table. He watched as she returned with the tea, setting it down carefully, then signing again, slower this time, more conversational, asking Margaret about her day, about whether she preferred lemon or honey. Margaret responded with growing confidence, her hands moving more freely now, her posture lifting as if she had been given permission to exist fully in a space that had once felt closed to her. Ethan felt a weight settle in his chest, not heavy, but undeniable. He had built companies, negotiated deals worth millions, structured systems designed for efficiency and perfection, and yet here, in the middle of one of his own restaurants, a young waitress in a modest uniform had accomplished something he never had. She had made his mother feel included without making it feel like a favor. He stepped forward before he could overthink it, his polished shoes quiet against the floor, his presence subtle but unmistakable as he approached the table. Lily noticed him first, her hands pausing mid-motion, her eyes flickering with a brief uncertainty before she straightened slightly. "Is everything all right here?" Ethan asked, his tone calm, measured, but softer than usual, as if the moment demanded it. Lily nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. She is doing great." She hesitated for half a second, then added, "She just needed someone who could speak her language." Ethan's gaze shifted to his mother, who was already looking at him, her expression different from anything he had seen in years. Not distant, not guarded, present, alive. Margaret lifted her hands and signed something quickly, her eyes bright. Lily translated without thinking. She said, "You should not worry so much. She is enjoying herself." Ethan let out a quiet breath he did not realize he had been holding, a faint smile touching his lips before he could stop it. "That is good to hear," he said, his voice lower now, more personal. For a moment, none of them moved. The noise of the restaurant faded again at the edges, replaced by something quieter, something more intimate. And as Ethan looked at Lily, really looked at her this time, he realized this was not just a kind gesture or a passing moment. This was something else entirely. Something that did not fit neatly into contracts or strategies. Something he could not buy, replicate, or control. And for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning of something he did not yet understand, but could not ignore. The rest of the evening unfolded with a quiet kind of gravity, as if the space around table 12 had become something different from the rest of the restaurant, something slower, more intentional. Lily moved in and out of her duties, balancing trays, refilling glasses, answering other tables with polite efficiency, yet her attention kept returning to Margaret, to the soft rhythm of their exchanges that now felt almost natural. Each time she approached, Margaret's face brightened just a little more, her hands lifting with less hesitation, her movements growing more fluid as confidence replaced uncertainty. Ethan remained nearby longer than he had intended, not seated, not interrupting, simply observing from a distance that allowed him to see without disrupting what was unfolding. He noticed the details he would have once overlooked, the way Lily bent slightly to maintain eye contact, the way she waited without rushing when Margaret formed her words, the way she smiled not out of obligation but out of genuine connection. It was not rehearsed. It was not strategic. It was real, and that realization unsettled him more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. When the dinner service began to slow and the crowd thinned, Ethan finally stepped forward again, this time with less hesitation. "Would you mind if I joined you for a moment?" he asked, directing the question gently toward both women. Lily glanced at Margaret before responding, translating the question with a quick, graceful motion of her hands. Margaret nodded almost immediately, a small but unmistakable invitation. Ethan took the seat across from them, something he had not done in a public setting with his mother in years. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply watched as Margaret signed something longer this time, her hands moving with a quiet urgency. Lily's expression softened as she translated. She says she used to love places like this when she was younger, before it became too exhausting to explain herself all the time. The words landed heavier than Ethan expected. He leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening for a brief second before he forced himself to stay present. I did not realize it felt that way, he admitted, his voice lower now, more honest than he was used to being in front of strangers. Lily hesitated, then spoke carefully. Most people do not. It is not something you see unless you are looking for it. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, his gaze shifting between Lily and his mother, noticing how easily they communicated now compared to the years of strained interactions he had grown accustomed to. How did you learn? He asked, turning his attention fully to Lily. The question seemed simple, but it carried weight, and for a brief moment, Lily's hands stilled in her lap. She looked down, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her apron, where a small, neatly folded handkerchief peeked out, the delicate stitching of a single word barely visible. I had someone in my life who needed me too, she said quietly, her voice steady but softer than before. She did not elaborate, and Ethan did not press, but something in her tone suggested a story far deeper than the words she offered. Margaret reached out then, placing her hand gently over Lily's, a gesture that was both instinctive and profound. Lily looked up, surprised, and Margaret signed slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was clear. Ethan watched, waiting for the translation, but this time, Lily did not speak right away. Her eyes shimmered slightly before she found her voice. She said, "You have kind hands. And kind hands do not forget." Silence settled over the table again, but it was not uncomfortable. It was full, layered with meaning that did not require explanation. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked behind years of routine and responsibility. He looked at Lily, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just a waitress in a uniform, not just someone performing a task, but a person carrying something rare, something he could not define but instinctively recognized as important. And in that moment, he realized this was no longer just about his mother, or the restaurant, or a single act of kindness. This was about something deeper, something that had quietly begun to rewrite the way he understood connection itself. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as the late evening crowd thinned, casting a softer glow across the polished tables and quieting the once lively space into something more intimate, more reflective. Lily moved through her closing tasks with practiced ease, stacking menus, wiping down surfaces, but her mind was no longer fully on routine. Every so often, her eyes drifted toward table 12, where Margaret still sat, now relaxed in a way that felt almost unfamiliar for someone who had entered the room, carrying so much quiet tension. Ethan remained seated across from her, his posture no longer rigid, his usual guarded demeanor replaced by something quieter, something more open. They were not speaking much now, not with words, but there was no awkwardness in the silence. Margaret signed occasionally, slower now, as if savoring the conversation rather than rushing through it, and Ethan watched her hands with a focus that suggested he was trying to understand more than just the movements. Lily hesitated near the service station, unsure whether to approach again or leave them to their moment, but before she could decide, Ethan glanced up and caught her eye. There was no authority in his expression this time, no expectation, just a simple, unspoken request. She walked over, her steps light, her presence calm. "We are closing soon," she said gently, her voice careful not to break the quiet atmosphere they had created. She signed the same message for Margaret, who nodded with a small, understanding smile. Margaret then signed something longer, her hands moving with a softness that felt almost affectionate. Lily watched closely, then smiled as she translated. She says, "Tonight felt like the first time she did not have to pretend." Ethan's gaze dropped for a brief second, the weight of those words settling deeper than he expected. He looked back at his mother, then at Lily, and for the first time, there was no distance between who he was in public and who he felt in that moment. "Thank you," he said, not as a formality, but as something genuine, something that carried meaning beyond the situation. Lily nodded, her fingers instinctively brushing the edge of the small handkerchief tucked into her apron, the embroidered word barely visible in the dim light. "She deserves that," Lily replied quietly. "Everyone does." The simplicity of her answer lingered, filling the space between them with something unspoken but deeply understood. A few minutes later, Margaret slowly stood, Ethan rising with her, his movements attentive in a way that suggested he was seeing her differently now, not as someone to manage, but as someone to be present with. Before leaving, Margaret reached for Lily's hand once more, her touch gentle but deliberate. She signed again, her eyes steady, her expression warm. Lily's breath caught slightly as she translated, her voice softer than before. She says, "Do not let the world make your hands forget what they know." Lily swallowed, nodding as she held Margaret's gaze for just a moment longer than usual. Then they stepped back, allowing Ethan to guide his mother toward the exit. Just before reaching the door, Ethan paused, turning back as if something had been left unsaid. For a second, he seemed like he might speak, but instead, he simply held Lily's gaze, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them before he followed his mother out into the cool night air. The door closed softly behind them, and the restaurant returned to its ordinary stillness. But Lily remained where she was, her hand still tingling from Margaret's touch, her thoughts unsettled in a way that was both unfamiliar and deeply stirring. She had spent years keeping her world small, predictable, manageable, but tonight had shifted something she could not yet name. And as she untied her apron and prepared to leave, she could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of something simple, but the quiet beginning of something far more significant than she had ever expected. The night air outside carried a quiet chill, the kind that settled gently rather than biting, as Ethan helped Margaret into the back seat of the car waiting at the curb. The city lights reflected softly against the window, flickering across her face as she turned to him and signed something slow and deliberate. Ethan watched carefully, still unfamiliar with the language but no longer intimidated by it. He caught only fragments, but the emotion behind it was clear. She was asking about Lily. He hesitated, then gave a small nod, as if answering more than just the question itself. "I noticed her too," he said quietly, even though Margaret could not hear the words, his voice carrying a sincerity he rarely showed. Margaret studied his face for a moment, then smiled in a way that felt knowing, almost amused, before settling back into her seat. As the car pulled away, Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk longer than necessary, his hands in his coat pockets, his thoughts far from the schedule that usually governed every minute of his life. Inside the restaurant, Lily stepped out into the employee hallway, the hum of the dining room fading behind her as she leaned briefly against the wall, exhaling slowly. She reached into her apron and pulled out the small handkerchief, unfolding it carefully, her thumb tracing the delicate stitching of the words sewn into the corner. Love. The thread had faded slightly over time, but the meaning had not. She closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself, before folding it back and tucking it away again. "You planning on staying here all night?" A voice called from behind her, breaking the quiet. It was Daniel, one of the line cooks, wiping his hands on a towel as he leaned against the doorway. Lily straightened quickly. "Just heading out," she replied, her voice calm, neutral, as if nothing inside her had shifted. He raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the dining room. "That table earlier. You really made a scene." The words were not harsh, but they carried an edge. Lily's expression tightened slightly. "I was just doing my job." Daniel shrugged. "Yeah, well, management does not exactly love extra attention like that. Especially not when it makes other customers uncomfortable." She nodded once, quietly, choosing not to argue. She had heard variations of that before. Keep things simple. Do not complicate the experience. Do not stand out too much. But tonight had not felt like something she could ignore. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly, stepping past him and heading toward the exit. Outside, the city felt different than it had just a few hours earlier. The sidewalks were quieter, the rush of the evening replaced by a slower, more reflective rhythm. Lily pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked the few blocks toward the bus stop, her mind replaying the evening in fragments. Margaret smiled. The way her hands had trembled at first, then steadied. Ethan's expression, shifting from distant to something she could not quite define. She stopped under the flickering streetlight, the bus still a few minutes away, and let out a breath she had been holding. "Do not let the world make your hands forget what they know." The words echoed in her mind, not as pressure, but as something grounding. A reminder. A promise she had made long ago and nearly forgotten in the noise of survival. Across town, Ethan stepped into his penthouse. The silence inside immediate and familiar, but tonight it felt different. Less comforting, more empty. He set his keys down, loosening his tie, but his thoughts remained anchored to the small restaurant and the woman who had changed the atmosphere of an entire room without raising her voice. He moved toward the window, looking out over the city lights stretching endlessly below, and for the first time, the view did not feel like control. It felt like distance. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object he had not realized he had kept. It was the receipt from the dinner, folded neatly, with a handwritten note at the bottom. He did not remember her writing it, but there it was. Everyone deserves to be understood. He read it once, then again, the words simple but impossible to ignore. And as he stood there, surrounded by everything he had built, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than any risk he had ever taken. For all his success, for all his influence, he had spent years building a world that functioned perfectly, but failed to truly connect. And somewhere in the middle of that realization, one quiet, undeniable thought surfaced. He wanted to see her again. The next morning arrived with a pale wash of sunlight stretching across the city, soft and indifferent to the quiet shifts that had taken place the night before. But for Ethan, nothing felt routine anymore. He stood in his office, a glass wall separating him from a skyline he had once found grounding, yet now it felt distant, almost irrelevant. His assistant's voice echoed faintly in the background, outlining meetings, numbers, projections, but he barely registered the words. His mind kept returning to a different image entirely, the steady movement of Lily's hands, the way his mother had come alive in a space that had always drained her. "Reschedule the 10 o'clock, he said suddenly, his tone calm but decisive. His assistant paused, surprised. "Sir, that is the investor call. Reschedule it," he repeated, already reaching for his coat. He did not offer an explanation, because for once, he did not have a strategic one. He only had a feeling, and that alone was unfamiliar enough to follow. Across town, Lily moved through her morning with the same quiet efficiency she always had, the small apartment she rented filled with soft light and the faint hum of the city waking outside her window. She poured coffee into a chipped mug, her movements steady, but her thoughts not as contained as usual. The night before lingered in her mind, not as a single moment, but as a series of small, vivid fragments. Margaret's smile, the warmth in her touch, the unexpected sincerity in Ethan's voice. She shook her head slightly, as if to ground herself. Moments like that did not usually lead anywhere. They stayed where they happened, untouched by the rest of life. That was how things worked. That was how she kept things simple. By the time she arrived at the restaurant, the air inside felt different, not in atmosphere, but in energy. Conversations hushed just slightly as she passed, glances lingering a moment longer than usual. She noticed it, but did not react, tying her apron with practiced ease and heading toward the service station. "You have a meeting with management today," Daniel muttered as he passed by, not unkindly, but not reassuring either. Lily paused, her fingers tightening slightly at the knot of her apron. "About last night?" she asked quietly. He gave a small shrug. "Probably." That was all he said before moving on, leaving the weight of it hanging in the air. Lily inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had not done anything wrong. She knew that. And yet, experience had taught her that being right did not always mean being safe. Before she could dwell on it further, the front door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Ethan. He did not announce himself. He did not carry the presence of someone expecting attention. He simply walked in, his gaze scanning the room until it found her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lily felt a flicker of uncertainty, something close to hesitation, but she pushed it aside and stepped forward. "Good morning," she said, her tone polite, professional, as if the night before had not shifted anything. Ethan nodded slightly, his expression softer than she expected. "Good morning." He glanced around briefly, then back at her. "I hope I am not interrupting." She shook her head. "We are just opening." There was a brief pause, the kind that usually ended conversations, but this one lingered, stretching just long enough to feel intentional. Ethan took a breath, as if choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "For what you did for my mother." Lily looked at him, really looked this time, noticing the absence of distance in his tone, the lack of formality. She did not need me, Lily replied gently. She just needed someone to meet her where she is. Ethan's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them again, something neither of them rushed to define. And just as the moment settled into something quiet and real, a voice cut through from behind them. Lily, we need to talk. Now. The manager stood near the office door, his expression tight, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. Lily's shoulders stiffened slightly, the fragile calm of the moment shifting. She glanced once at Ethan, then back at the manager, and nodded. Of course. And as she turned to follow, something in Ethan's expression changed, not with anger, but with clarity, as if he already knew this conversation would not be simple, and that this time, he was not going to stay on the sidelines. The office door closed softly behind Lily, but the sound felt heavier than it should have, like a quiet line being drawn between two different worlds. The manager did not ask her to sit. He remained standing behind the desk, arms crossed, his expression already set in a way that told her this was not a conversation meant to understand. You caused a disruption last night, he said flatly, flipping through a report as if the conclusion had already been written before she walked in. Lily stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her voice calm but steady. I helped a customer who needed assistance. He shook his head, not even looking at her. You drew attention. You made other guests uncomfortable. This is not the kind of environment we are trying to create. The words were controlled, professional, but they carried something colder underneath. Lily felt it, the familiar pressure of being told that kindness had a limit when it did not fit into convenience. She was being ignored. Lily replied quietly. I could not just leave her like that. The manager finally looked up, his gaze sharp. That is not your decision to make. Your job is to serve efficiently, not to turn the dining room into a spectacle. The word lingered. Spectacle. As if understanding someone had been a performance instead of a necessity. Lily's chest tightened, but her expression did not break. Respect is not a spectacle, she said, her voice still gentle, but no longer uncertain. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, and something in the manager's posture shifted, not with agreement, but with irritation. He set the report down, his tone final. We are going to let you go, Lily. Effective immediately. The words landed without volume, without drama, but they echoed louder than anything else had that morning. Lily blinked once, the air in the room suddenly feeling thinner, but she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply nodded, as if she had expected this outcome somewhere deep down. I understand, she said softly. And she did. Not because it was right, but because it was familiar. Outside the office, Ethan stood near the front, his attention fixed on the closed door, the quiet tension in the room impossible to ignore. He had not meant to listen, but he had heard enough. The words had reached him, clear and unmistakable. Spectacle. Let you go. Something inside him tightened, not with impulse, but with clarity. When the door opened and Lily stepped out, her posture composed but her eyes carrying something heavier, he moved forward without hesitation. What happened? He asked, his voice low but firm. Lily paused, clearly not expecting him to still be there. For a second, she considered deflecting, keeping things simple, but something in his expression made that impossible. They said I was not a good fit, she replied, the understatement deliberate, controlled. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze flicking toward the office before returning to her. Because you treated my mother with respect? Lily gave a small, almost tired smile. Because I did it in a way they did not like. The honesty of it hung between them, unfiltered, undeniable. Ethan exhaled slowly, his composure still intact, but something beneath it had shifted into resolve. Stay here, he said quietly, before turning toward the office without waiting for a response. Lily watched him go, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, not about what had happened, but about what was about to happen next. Inside the office, the manager barely had time to react before Ethan stepped in, the atmosphere changing instantly, not with volume, but with presence. I believe there has been a mistake, Ethan said calmly, closing the door behind him. The manager straightened, confusion flashing across his face. Sir, I was just handling a personnel issue. You were dismissing someone for doing exactly what this company claims to stand for. Ethan interrupted, his tone still even, but now carrying an authority that left no room for dismissal. The manager faltered, trying to recalibrate, but the ground had already shifted beneath him. And for the first time in that space, the definition of what mattered was no longer being decided by convenience, but by something far more difficult to ignore. The office remained quiet for a moment after Ethan's words settled in, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than confusion. The manager shifted uneasily, his confidence no longer as firm as it had been just minutes ago. "Sir, with all due respect, we have policies," he said carefully, choosing his words as if they might steady the situation. Ethan held his gaze, calm but unwavering. "Then your policies need to be rewritten." There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, just a clarity that made resistance feel pointless. "This company was built on the idea that people matter," he continued. "Not just the ones who are easy to serve, but especially the ones who are not." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, the logic he relied on felt insufficient against something that was not about efficiency or numbers. Ethan took a small step closer, not aggressive, but intentional. "You dismissed someone for creating connection in a place that lacks it," he said. "That is not a liability. That is exactly what we need." Outside the office, Lily stood near the service counter, her apron already untied, folded neatly in her hands as if she had already accepted the outcome. A few co-workers watched from a distance, their curiosity quiet but present. She kept her focus on the simple act of folding fabric, grounding herself in something familiar while everything else shifted around her. The door opened again, and Ethan stepped out, his expression composed but changed in a way that was difficult to ignore. He walked directly toward her, not slowing, not hesitating. "You are not leaving," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet certainty that drew every eye in the room. Lily looked up, caught off guard. "I already have," she replied softly, lifting the folded apron slightly as if it explained everything. Ethan shook his head once. "No, that decision has been reversed." A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Lily hesitated, searching his expression for something she could question, something she could refuse, but found none. "Why?" she asked, not out of defiance, but out of genuine uncertainty. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly around the restaurant, taking in the space as if seeing it differently now, before returning his attention to her. "Because what you did last night should not be punished," he said. "It should be the standard." The simplicity of his words carried more weight than any explanation could. Lily's grip on the apron loosened slightly, but she did not move. "That does not change how they see it," she said quietly. Ethan's gaze remained steady. "Then we change how they see it." Before she could respond, the manager stepped out behind him, his posture noticeably altered, his tone far more measured than before. "Lily," he began, the word unfamiliar on his tongue without authority behind it. "We would like to offer you your position back." The phrasing was careful, but the shift was clear. Lily looked between them, the moment stretching as she processed what was being placed in front of her. This was not just about a job anymore. It was about something larger, something that had quietly begun to reshape the space around her. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself once more, then nodded, not with excitement, but with quiet resolve. "I will stay," she said. And as she spoke, something in the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested this was no longer just a restaurant returning to normal. It was the beginning of a change that would not easily be undone. The days that followed did not explode into change all at once, but unfolded in quiet, deliberate shifts that slowly reshaped the space from the inside out. The kind of transformation that did not demand attention yet could not be ignored. It began with small things. A printed card placed discreetly near the entrance that read, "We welcome all forms of communication." A short training session added before opening hours, where staff stood in a loose circle, awkward at first, learning simple signs for welcome, thank you, and how can I help you. Some stumbled. Some laughed nervously. But they tried. And that mattered. Lily stood among them, not as someone above or separate, but as someone guiding with quiet patience, her hands moving slowly, repeating gestures until they felt natural. Across the room, Ethan watched without interrupting, his presence no longer distant, No longer just observational. He was involved now, not through directives, but through attention. Margaret returned a few days later, stepping into the restaurant with less hesitation than before, her eyes scanning the room not with caution, but with curiosity. When one of the newer servers greeted her with a simple, slightly imperfect sign for welcome, her face lit up in a way that needed no translation. Lily noticed from across the room and smiled, not at the perfection of the gesture, but at the effort behind it. The shift was working, not flawlessly, not instantly, but genuinely. That evening, as the restaurant settled into its usual rhythm, Ethan approached Lily near the service station, his steps unhurried, his expression thoughtful. "You changed this place," he said quietly, not as a compliment, but as an observation. Lily shook her head slightly, a small smile touching her lips. "No," she replied. "I just reminded people of something they already knew." Ethan considered that, the simplicity of it, the truth of it, and nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but steady, familiar. Then Margaret approached, her steps measured but confident, her presence drawing both of their attention. She signed something slowly, her eyes moving between them with warmth and intention. Lily translated softly, her voice carrying just enough to bridge the moment. "She says a voice is not always something you hear." Lily paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the handkerchief in her apron, the stitched word hidden but present. "Sometimes, it is something you feel when someone chooses to understand you." Ethan looked at his mother, then at Lily, the meaning settling deeper than words alone could carry. He took a breath, something quiet but resolute forming beneath it. "I spent a long time building things that worked," he said, his voice low, steady. "But I did not realize how much was missing until now." Lily met his gaze, not with awe, not with hesitation, but with clarity. "It is not too late to build something that matters," she said gently. Margaret smiled, her hands lifting once more, forming a simple, unmistakable sign. "Family." The word hung in the air, not as a label, but as a possibility. Ethan's expression softened, something unguarded finally settling into place. He reached out, not dramatically, not urgently, but with quiet intention, his hand finding Lily's, not to lead, not to claim, but simply to connect. And for the first time, it felt like everything he had built was no longer about distance or control, but about presence, about choosing to see, to understand, to stay. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a room that had learned to listen in new ways, the beginning of something real did not need to be announced. It was already there.